Hey, buddy boy.
What's going? I like the hat. Well done.
Let's talk about really, that which was the big one today, which was waiting for banks to report. And here we are. And the crazy thing about it is, J.P. Morgan's numbers were incredible, and stock's not doing much here. Whereas, not surprisingly, Wells Fargo was basically a minnow, right? I mean, they are slowly becoming the small fish in the money center bank pond. I don't know. I'm not sure what to make of it. The reserves were a big part of it. What's your take?
Yeah, the loan loss reserves for Wells Fargo were ridiculous. I mean, worse than people were expecting. And the stock is acting in kind. JP Morgan, I mean, listen, the trading profits were ridiculous in a good way. But even their loan loss provisions were pretty staggering. So, yeah, the question you have to ask yourself, stock performance aside, is, these banks, are the provisions they're taking trying to tell you something for where we are 6 months from now, or are they just being ridiculously, to use that word again, cautious? And I don't know what the answer is. I think I do.
What is it?
I think they see the consumer being stretched as we get into the later part of this year, early next year, and they're guarding against that. That's my take.
Credit spreads at this point are not, they're a very tricky assessment barometer or whatever. I think between stimulus and essentially what the Fed has done, it's impossible to tell where the consumer is and where loans are. You're right. I mean, JP Morgan, $10.5 billion on reserves. And they were, not surprisingly, really smart. They took record trading revenues and they plowed them into reserves. And that's what we expect from JP Morgan. And that was a 55-cent drag on earnings. And yet they crushed it. I think they earned 136 a share. The street was around 115 a share. And that aforementioned 55-cent drag from reserves means these numbers were incredible. The investment banking revenues, I'm sorry, I'm not saying they're going away, but this was once in a lifetime, right? This was the pandemic. This was everybody issue as much debt as they can because the Fed has just lowered rates to zero. Everybody rushes in there. The trading revenues were extraordinary. And so it does come down to, who do you want to own at this point? And I think JP Morgan used something like this. Their words were, "We're kind of the safe port in the storm." And they are. But what do you do with Wells Fargo here?
I think we've been pretty unanimous in our dislike of the stock, and most of the problems with Wells Fargo have been self-induced. With that said, many of their problems now are a function of what's going on in the United States that they really have no control over, and that's a pretty toxic mix. And when you have the CEO probably coming on and saying it was I'm paraphrasing now, but pretty much a disaster, you have to take him at his word. So does that $22 March low come into the equation? I think it absolutely does. And what's really interesting to me is how quiet Warren Buffett's been on the entire Wells Fargo situation now for the last 2 years. And I'd be interested to see, if anything, if he adds to this position or if he pulls the ripcord like he did with the airlines.
He's been noticeably quiet on his banks. We've taken a look at his holdings. We obviously know what he puked up in terms of airlines. If anything, on the banks, he's been nibbling, right? He nibbled some PNC in May. I think there's a case to be made that Buffett goes back to what he knows, and he goes back to old kind of school economy. And I think it's hard for me to not see JP Morgan as having some pretty extraordinary value here. It's also hard for me to say that there isn't a bigger issue at Wells Fargo. So agreeing with that, they cut the dividend by 80%. It's now 10 cents a share. I think you have a case with Wells Fargo that even if some of this looks very conservative, I don't know why the stock needs to be bought anytime soon. I think it should continue to underperform, and underperform it has the rest of the money center banks. So I think the bottom lines on today for banks are maybe I think you've used this word. I don't know if you took wordsmithing at G-Town. You love the word chasm.
I like the word because it has an H in it that that I
It's a
love when
sneaky
you have
H.
these superfluous
Sneak,
letters like Brett Favre.
sneaky H. So the chasm that exists between what banks are telling you and what the rest of the market is telling you. We've only upped those loan loss provisions, and that's something that should have people a little bit scared. Anybody that's been through 2008 says nothing would ever surprise me. The fact that JPM is playing it conservative here is also a reason why this could be a great stock to own right now, because these provisions may not be indicative of the world we live in.
Yeah, and listen, the other reason to own it is because it rightly trades at a premium to tangible book, and it probably should trade at a larger premium. And we've talked about that. And I think their tangible book today, when they reported, was right around $62, whereas Wells Fargo and Citi, for that matter, trades at a discount, as they both should. It's just a question of how much of a discount. I think it gets worse. And how much of a premium for JP Morgan. I think it gets better. So that divide between those banks are going to continue to grow.
Give me the name of 4 banks that are part of the lineage of the current structure of JP Morgan. This is what's so cool. We do this with rock and roll all the time, like bands that actually this guy played for this band and this band for that band. But if you think about
Chase Manhattan Bank.
Yes, sure.
Which I believe there was some manufacturer's Hanover at some
Manny
point.
Hanny. I didn't think you were going to get that one.
Played itself into that.
Yeah, Manny Hanny.
Other 80s bank.
You're missing a biggie.
Began with a T. Help me out.
T. I don't know, but there's another bank that basically formed the other half of the Chase combo that ultimately JPM. This is obviously, we're talking about the last iterations. It'd be fascinating to go deeper because Manny Hanny, you're starting to get into some of the regional stuff that was consolidated under Chase and Chemical Bank. Remember Chemical
Bank is what yes, Chemical Bank. Absolutely. Yeah. I interviewed at Chemical Bank.
Of course you did. Who didn't?
School.
I mean, they had a great training program. And if you think about that, these banks, they really were, there was a difference between Wall Street and, look, if you got the job at Chemical, it was a decent shop, but it was a commercial bank, right? It wasn't.
That was not considered Wall Street. Manufacturers Hanover Trust was not considered Wall Street, 100%. Now they'll get lumped together, rightly or wrongly. It's all considered Wall Street. Maybe that's part of the problem, by the way. Maybe we should go back to the 80s model. But, Citi was the one that sort of broke the mold, and that really didn't work out that well for them.
Well, it worked out great for Jamie Dimon. So if you think about that, Sandy Weil, I think he plucked, I'm not sure if it was the Rob Rubin, but whoever sat on top. And that's really what had Jamie say, I'm out of here. Because Jamie was one of Sandy Weil's top lieutenants and effectively was ready to make that move. And then he went over to Capital One, I believe, and then built that into no, not Capital One. Is it Capital One? What was he running in Chicago? Yeah, I think so. But the point to make about 80s and back to where we were when we were coming out of school and interviewing for some of these bank training programs. By the way, I did that with my tail between my. I thought I was selling my soul to the devil by going to Wall Street. I always, for whatever, rightly or wrongly, thought I was more creative than that. I really didn't want to do it. In fact, I went into the restaurant business for a while, but that's for another show. Glass-Steagall, remember the Glass-Steagall Act? So the tearing down of Glass-Steagall, which after I believe this is Depression era, the creation of these separate silos in which insurance companies and banks and investment banks and trusts could not play for fear of creating what we created into the credit crisis, and obviously banks run amok, which are now nationalized, which is our soapbox again. Do you really want to own banks? Because effectively, the government is ready to stamp on your neck whenever.
Well,
sorry to depress you, man.
No, I know you got fishing on the mind, so you're out there in the Hamptons. So see if Frank Mundus is out there, and I'll encourage our viewers to Google to see who Frank Mundus is or was. I don't know if he's now deceased. But with that, I bid you adieu.
I hope I don't need a bigger boat, bro. I'll see you tomorrow.